It's been several years, but it's great to have back on the podcast Coach Brian McCormick. Coach, welcome back.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here again.
For those who haven't followed Coach McCormick, I consider him the OG when it comes to decision-based training, small-sided games, and constraints-led approach, and whatever other terminology they come up with. He would humbly tell you that he didn't invent those things, but I think he's been one of the pioneers in the basketball coaching world and educating us about those topics. And I've learned a ton from him and the content that he's put out and the books that he's written. And so I appreciate everything he's done, and I try to thank him as frequently as I can for doing all that work. One of the contributions and the most recent contributions is what I wanted to have him on to talk about today, his newest book, Nada, the Antifragile Defense. Coach, give us a 30,000-foot view on this book and then why a book specifically on defense.
First, thank you again. Thanks for the introduction. You're too kind. The book, let's see. Well, first I wrote a book kind of because some of my oldest friends, one of the first articles I ever wrote back when I was writing for Basketball Sense magazine and Winning Hoops back when I was a college student, one of the first articles I wrote was defense is overrated. And basically it was about how, when you're coaching 9 and 10-year-olds and you think you're a defensive coach, it's basically just because defense is ahead of the offense because you have a bunch of players who aren't very strong and not very skilled. So it's easy to be good at defense. And so don't trick yourself into thinking that what you're teaching is, amazing. It's just that it's easy to overwhelm players who aren't very skilled yet. But since then, like a couple of my friends in Los Angeles and everything, I always joked that I was, just an offensive coach and I couldn't coach defense and stuff like that. And as I wrote more books and stuff, I hadn't really tackled defense. I knew eventually it was one of the ones that I wanted to write. And I was kind of, I guess, waiting for the right time, to have something not important, but something new to say, I guess. I had written about some of the defensive differences, I guess in terms of the way that I teach defense, that I think a lot of them are fairly commonplace now. But when I was writing about them in my newsletter back in the day, and then Fake Fundamentals, about a decade ago, things like what I was talking about, closeouts and stuff like that, people thought I was insane, but I had already written about those things. And so, I was waiting for a time where I really had something else, and not just rehashing the same thing I'd already written in a different book. So, that's kind of, what the why, the what. So basically the idea, I guess one idea is, I had a really good junior college team, before COVID, and we were probably top 5 offense in the country, and we didn't go as far as I would have liked. And, part of that is my expectations probably were a little bit high based on, where we stood in terms of budget and scholarships and everything compared to the teams that we were competing against. Like, we exceeded everybody else's expectations, but we I think that team ended up with 6 Division I players, and we didn't make it out of our region, which in any other region besides Florida and Texas, you would think that, I can't coach it all. But, in Florida and Texas, the only 3 teams from the region are allowed to go to the national tournament, and all three teams made it to the Final Four. So, at the national tournament. So, we were knocked out by the best teams, but still it was disappointing to look and say, okay, I'm probably never going to have at this school where I was, I figured I would never have a team that talented again. Just because everything kind of broke right in terms of how I was able to sign players and who I was able to get, and based on international players, and now more teams were recruiting international players and yada yada. I just didn't think I was going to get a team at that school as talented again, and we didn't get to the national tournament. So I was like, well, I need to change something. Like, we can't keep playing the same way with less talented players and expect to compete. And then COVID happened and they shut down sports at that school. So I was no longer coaching there, but one of the things I talked about is like, okay, our offense was good enough, but it was our defense. And our defense was, good enough, but it was fragile. When I had the opportunity then to coach other teams, I was able to take things that I had done at other stops in my career when we had been better in some aspects of defense and kind of combine everything, then kind of able to, coming off the back of a season where I coached 115 games, write a book between 3 teams, write a book, kind of combining everything. And that was kind of fresh in my mind based on kind of all the ideas that I'd wanted to do defensively over, the 20 years or so that I'd been coaching.
You say that this is, and I don't want people confused and thinking that this is just another defensive system. You described this as kind of just being more of like a philosophy. Can you elaborate on the core philosophy behind NADA and then how it differs from a traditional defensive system?
I try not to be too prescriptive in anything that I write because every situation and every team is going to be different. Most teams, I would expect, cannot implement every single thing that I write about in the book. Some do. I think my team this year, we probably did almost everything. I kind of walked into a situation where the personnel was kind of tailor-made, for my defensive ideas. So, that doesn't happen very often. In terms of it being a philosophy, basically it's ideas to use, it's ideas to implement within what you have. And that is, to me, I think your offense and your defense should be complementary. So if you're saying, offensively, we need to play slow, well, just because then I'm saying to press, or be an aggressive pressing team in the book, that probably doesn't fit with then being a slow, maybe conservative offensive team, right? So, I want to write with enough flexibility that you can incorporate, different things. So if I have my system and my system is we're going to always force baseline or whatever, which works, it's fine. Okay, that's my system. But what if I now have a team that has a great shot blocker and I want to force them into the shot blocker every time instead of just forcing them into the baseline? Well, if my whole system is based around forcing to the baseline, is that adaptable to now using the talent that I have at my disposal? Maybe, maybe not. So, that's just the idea of, I don't want to be so prescriptive that it only works with certain teams that want to do certain things. I want to provide kind of a template or an idea, and to some extent, I guess, a menu where you can say, okay, well, I don't like this idea, but I like these three things, and I'm going to use these three things. And it's not so, again, prescriptive that I can only use those three things if I use the other three things too. But I can pick and all right, yes, I like this idea and I like this idea and I'm going to incorporate those, but I disagree with how he teaches closeouts. So I'm not going to do that. But I like this idea of how to play help defense, or we're not going to have two on the ball, or, how we're going to guard, ball screens, different things. So I'm not trying to tell coaches how to coach. Basically, I'm trying to provide ideas and examples that have been successful for me that coaches can implement within their own philosophy and their own ideas and their own personnel, their own situation. Using it with, an under 12 team is going to be different than using it with a professional team. I would not be able to do everything, that I did this year with under 17s with an NBA team. I know that, right? Even at the Division I, men's high Division I level, probably wouldn't do everything. Probably would do a lot of it. I've talked to a couple of Division I women's coaches, and they're trying to do a lot of, what's talked about in the book. So I think it can be successful at, higher levels. But I also think, especially at the NBA level where, so many games and everything like that, it just changes how you have to play everything, and lack of practice time, everything. You have to, try to, I talked to a youth coach about it, last week. He's like, I only have practice, I think he said once a week, so I'm just going to take these two. He's like, if you were going to only do 2 or 3 ideas from the book, what would you do? And so we talked about it, and he's like, okay, yeah, that's a great idea. I'm just going to do these 2 things. And that's going to be my focus of my defense, is trying to do these 2 things and teach these 2 things, because there's no way in 1 hour a week or 1 practice a week, I can teach everything. And that's just the constraints that you coach within. And so you have to adjust accordingly. And so again, that's kind of the basic idea of why, to me, it's more of a philosophy. It's adaptable to whatever it is that you want to achieve. But the basic idea is, at the heart of it, is that defensively, I don't think great defenses can only do one thing. In today's game, I think you used to be able to do one thing, but I think offenses are getting so good now that you have to be adaptable. You can't just guard ball screens in one way the entire game. You can't just guard a good post player the same way every single time down the court. You have to be able to play both. And this is what I learned from the college team that I talked about is, we were a fairly conservative defensive team, and we are decent at being a conservative defensive team, but that put a ton of pressure on our offense. We had to be great offensively every game because we weren't creating turnovers, right? We weren't generating points from our defense. We really didn't have the capacity to kind of change a game, with our defense. To me, the best teams can play multiple ways. And that is both in terms of, you can win a game when your offense isn't going well. You can win a game when your defense isn't going well. You can play fast, you can play slow. And so that's kind of the idea of being anti-fragile is when your opponent takes you away from maybe what you want to do, can you still thrive in that situation? Can you thrive in a more chaotic situation? Can you create that more chaotic situation and then be able to thrive? And that's part of what, the idea behind most of the defensive ideas in this book is to try to get offenses out of their normal rhythm and try to get them into a more chaotic environment, because most offenses are then fragile in those situations because coaches are teaching one specific thing. They want to run this play, they want to run that play, they want to get the ball to this person in this position, and if you take them away from that different ways and force them to be better players, to make decisions, with the ball, to make decisions quicker, et cetera, most teams, struggle.
We should have led with this. What does NADA stand for?
Oh, sorry. NADA is no advantage, disadvantage. When I wrote Saba, my offensive book, it was small advantage, big advantage. So those are the 4 states essentially of a game. So a lot of people talk, like coming from soccer, they talk about, the kind of the 4 areas of the game. So you have, offense, half court offense, offensive transition, half court defense, defensive transition, kind of being the 4 states. And then some people throw in like a special situation, out of bounds plays, as kind of a 5th. And so to me, I kind of simplified that, and every possession, it's either you have a big advantage offensively, a small advantage offensively, it's from a neutral position, or the defense has an advantage. Ideas that work or transfer the best are ones that are able to be the most general, right? And so those states, it doesn't matter. You could be inbounding the full court. Those same states go. You don't have to decide, well, is inbounding after a whistle, is that still defensive transition, or now is it just a defensive half court possession because it's after a whistle and so it's a dead ball, and stuff like that. So for me, the possession states, they're constantly in flux. So a half court possession isn't always the same half court possession. If the defense comes out and tries to trap your pick and roll and you hit the short roll, now you've got a 4-on-3. Well, that's basically defensive transition at that point. It's no longer a half court defensive possession. It's more in line with what you would do in your defensive transition in a 4-on-3 fast break drill. To me, rather than, half court and then it becomes full court. And then it's like, no, this is we tried to get a defensive advantage, or we created the defensive advantage. And then we know from my offensive book that if you make one pass out of a defensive advantage, now you've created an offensive advantage, at least a small advantage, maybe a big advantage. That's how you guard things. And so to me, it's a more general way to look at the same idea of breaking the game into the different offense, defense, half court, full court type stuff.
You started down this, so I'm going ahead and let you keep going down it. Our audience is familiar with offensive advantage, big advantage, small advantage. I don't know that a lot of defensive advantage talk has really been thought through a lot. I know we think about it, talk about it, but I think one of the things that would be helpful is, what would it look like? What would be an example or two of on the court when you have, as a defense, successfully reduced a small advantage to no advantage, and then to take it to being a defensive advantage?
Okay, well, to go from a small advantage to back to neutral, that would be something like if, let's say we get a little bit of penetration, we kick out, and we've got, maybe like a long closeout to the 3-point line. That's at least a small advantage, if not a big advantage, probably depending on who the shooter is catching the ball. So if I'm able to close out and you hold the ball and don't shoot it and you don't drive past me, well, now I've taken away that advantage. Now we're back to neutral. Now you have to do something to create another advantage. Now, a situation where we create a defense advantage, let's say, and this is one of the things that I talk about in terms of being anti-fragile. Let's say that same kick out, let's say there's a miscommunication. Now we've got 2 players running to the ball on that closeout. Well, instead of looking at it as a mistake, now we're going to trap it. So we've got 2 people on the ball for our rules, we never want 2 on the ball. If we end up with 2 on the ball, we want to trap it and turn it into a defensive advantage. So we get 2 on the ball. Now, let's say that kick was to the corner. We got 2 people running, to close out, miscommunication. But now we got 2 people on there. He holds the ball. Now we've got a trap. Now we've got a defensive advantage, right? So now everybody, the other 3 players need to recognize that, because anytime there's a defensive advantage, for the most part, somebody should be open. If we're trapping somewhere, somebody's open. So we have to try to, reduce or force, the most difficult pass. The other 3 players need to recognize that we have that defensive advantage and hopefully get into the passing lane where they make that and get the steal. And now we've got a layup on the other end. That would be an instance of, going straight from, an advantage, and instead of going to neutral, going straight to a defensive advantage. Same idea, trapping a pick and roll, that gives us a defensive advantage, at least for that second. That's the goal of the trap, is to create the defensive advantage. Double teaming in the post, same idea. The idea is we're trying to create a defensive advantage. And well, not always. Some people are going to trap just to get the ball out of, an offensive player's hands. They're not really trying to create a defensive advantage. For us, if we're going to commit 2 people to the ball, if we're going to double team the post, we're going there with the intention that we're trying to create a turnover. We're not just trying to get that player to pass the ball back out. If we're just trying to, let's say we're double teaming because it was a mismatch, then we're probably just coming, if we're not really going for the turnover, then we're going to double team into a switch, basically. Again, it depends on who we're playing against and what we're trying to accomplish. But for us, we never want 2 people on the ball, because that means somebody's wide open. And if we end up with 2 people on the ball, that means we're trapping, and we're really trying to create that defensive advantage and not allow that easy pass, because if we've attracted 2 people to the ball and they have an easy pass, well, now we're in rotations and they're going to get a big advantage somewhere.
I'm going to ask it this way, because I love this language and this terminology. And again, I think that the offensive minds will understand this. It's just applying it to the defensive side. On offense, we're trying to attack space, draw 2, and then get people in a blender, dominoes, however you want to describe it. From a defensive perspective, I think communicating this to our players, but that idea of you're defending space, which kind of goes, I think it makes your defense more effective, because we have historically talked about just guarding a player. But offensively, we don't want our players to just be thinking offensively about, I'm a player, I'm going to make a move, I'm going to create my own advantage. Especially younger players, they just don't. NBA, that might work. Professional level, that might work. But it's very difficult for players individually to create their own advantages. Therefore, if you're playing primarily against systems that are going to use space and ball screens and whatnot, being able to describe then for them that, no, we're trying to defend space. I've talked about it a little bit, but you probably can describe it much better. How that idea of defending space is different from the traditional focus of guarding a specific player.
Right. So there's 2 parts to it. So when we're on the ball, the on-ball defender, I want them thinking you're guarding the ball, you're not guarding the player, right? So wherever the ball is, that's where, we want you to move. And I think a lot of defense is built around worst case scenarios. When I said defensive players, you need to be able to cross your feet on defense, right? The argument that I heard for years was, well, if the offensive player times it perfectly, then they're going to beat you with the crossover and you're going to trip and fall. And so my argument was always, if an offensive player times a move perfectly, you're going to beat the defensive player no matter what the defensive player does. The offensive player has that advantage. I learned Doc Rivers, I heard him say, when the offense gets to say go. If the offensive player times any move perfectly, they're going to gain an advantage. And so instead of setting up a defense based on worst case scenarios, right? So we're never going to cross our feet, because if we cross our feet at this exact moment, we might get beat. Well, no, we're going to cross our feet because that's going to give us the best chance to defend most of the time. And we're still going to get beat sometimes, but those times we would probably get beat regardless. So that's the first. Like, we want to guard the ball. I'm not afraid to go for fakes. Our goal is to not go for shot fakes, any coach. But to me, if I'm closing out, if I've got a long closeout, the traditional idea was, well, you need to guard the shot and the drive. My belief has been, against a good offensive player, you can't stop both. You have to guard one thing. And so if you think this player is going to shoot, if this player is a shooter, then you are taking away the shot first. And once you take away the shot, then you can figure out everything else, right? And so that means that if he gets you with a shot fake, you did your job. You took away the shot, right? You forced him to dribble, right? And so that's different than what most coaches would want. I mean, there are certain players that can take away both, and there are situations, if it's a shorter closeout, then you can take away both. I'm talking about, a long closeout situation where you're running at. In those situations, like I tell players, like I never want to get beat with a shot fake if I'm standing in front of you, right? So if I'm in defensive position, okay, I shouldn't go for a shot fake. But if I'm sprinting at you and my job is to take away that shot, then I can understand if you go for a shot fake, right? Because we're playing the ball. And so if the ball's going up to shoot, okay, you're playing the ball. Offense made a good move. He beats you. It happens. Okay. That's the other thing. Like, I don't expect defense to be perfect. Every possession, I can show what looks at the end like a great possession. We get a 24-second violation, but we made 5 different mistakes on that possession. It's just how we react to those mistakes. That's what makes a defense great. And so if we make that extra effort and we take away that big advantage, that shooter catching the ball open, and we sprint and we take it away and force him to dribble inside the 3-point line, and now we rotate, we help, and when we get back, etc., it looks like a great possession, even though most coaches are going, oh, well, we shouldn't jump at the shot fake. We got to stay on our feet. It's like, well, but if we slow down and we close out, we stop in front, well, we don't get that great possession because he shoots an open 3-pointer. And then you're mad at him because he didn't get out to the shooter quick enough, right? And so now you're just coaching based on the outcomes instead of your process, right? So my process is, look, your job is to take away the shooter. You do whatever you have to do to take away that shot. Okay. If you get beat, you get beat, and we figure it out next. But once that player shoots, there's no more defense. I remember, Lute Olson years ago, he said the hardest thing to defend was dribble penetration. And so our goal in our initial defensive shell is we want to try to guard space so that it looks as though there is not a lane to drive into. Our goal is not to have to help, right? Because once you help, okay, then you're in rotation. Then there's a small advantage, maybe a big advantage. If you move the ball, you're going to get a good shot. So our goal is not to help, but we want to look like we're in help, right? So when you come down the court, we all want to look almost like we're in a zone defense, okay, even though we're matched up and we're playing man-to-man. We want to take, like you said, we want to take away that space. We want to make it look like, the lanes to the basket are smaller and there's not much room to use, so that we're only moving in one direction. We're not helping in and then recovering, right? If we're going to commit and we're going to help, it's a switch. We don't help and recover. We can stunt one step and then we're getting back. But if you stunt, your responsibility is your own player, okay? And whoever's guarding the ball, it's their responsibility to stop the ball. If you help all the way, we don't guard 2 things in a row. So if I rotate all the way, I get in front of you, my man's no longer my responsibility. Somebody else has to get there. Because to me, again, we set up offensively. One of the earliest things, I was taught as a coach, what's the hardest thing to defend? 2 things in a row, screen the screener action, stuff like that, right? Hardest thing to defend, 2 things in a row. Well, but on defense, then we're telling players, you got to do 2 things in a row. You got to close out to take away the shot, and you got to guard the drive. You got to help and stop the ball, and you got to recover and guard your man. And so we're setting up defensive players to have to do the things that on offense we're saying are the hardest things to do. And so basically a lot of NADA is simply saying, if we're setting up defensive players to have to do the hardest things, we're making our defense fragile. And so we're going to get rid of those things that make our defense fragile, and we're going to give up things. And that's one of the basic tenets of the book is, again, there's no perfect possession. We're not going to be perfect. We're not going to take away shots every single time down the court. So instead, we want to dictate which shots we give up, right? We want to make sure if it's a shooter at the 3-point line, like I said, that's why I'm okay running him off the line, even if he beats us and gets into even if it's a rhythm 15-foot pull-up jump shot, that's the shot that we'll live with instead of giving up that catch and shoot 3, because over time, it's the less efficient shot. We want to take away shots at the rim, and then we want to guard shooters at the 3-point line. We'll live with anything kind of in between there because over time, it's going to be less efficient. One of the things that worked out as kind of I designed how our defense is set up, because we don't help and recover a lot, we tend to force a lot of one-on-one, which some coaches are like, great, my player one-on-one, we're going to score one-on-one. But because we're in that space, it's one-on-one, but it's not, wide open space. It's the threat of help. So now you're not 100% committed. And so we actually do a very good job of at least this year, we did a very good job of, we gave up the fewest assisted baskets, because most times we're taking away the easy passes. So when you drive, you either have to make that hard pass or you have to try to finish it yourself. So we're prone to give up high scoring games to, the best player on the other team. But then we take, when we played a local team that we played, that was one that made it to the final 8 as well. I think we played them 4 times this year. I think 3 were regular season, 1 was preseason. And they have a guard who some believe is the best guard in the age group in the country. I think he scored 20 points every single time against us. But to me, his best skills is passing. And each game we played them, his assists went down because I kept telling my guy, I'm like, look, don't overhelp. Make him a scorer. Yeah, he'll get 20 points, but he's taking 18, 20 shots to get 20 points because they're, guarded, difficult shots. And his assists are going down. And so now the guy in the corner who's a good shooter, he's not getting attempts now. And so that's better. We'd rather have this guy shooting, even though he's their best player, we're going to have him shoot contested 2-point tough shots instead of giving up wide open threes to other players. Because the other thing, to me, over the course of a game, then when it gets down, if it was a close game, 1, the other players aren't in rhythm because they haven't had as many shots because you've kind of forced everything towards the one player. And then 2, that guy's had to do so much. And with our team this year, he'd probably get guarded by 3 or 4 different players. And then when we switched and stuff like that, get guarded by even more players, but, have 3 or 4 players kind of at different points assigned to him, so hopefully at the end of the game, then he's tired, worn down because he's had to carry so much and he hasn't been able to make those easy passes. Everything's been either a tough shot or a tough pass, and so that's kind of, one of my basic philosophy, I'm not worried. People with, this kid's got 20 against us going into the 4th. We should do. Okay. But the kid who shoots threes that doesn't have any, I don't want to now change our defense and now give up, a couple easy wide open shots. So, and that's not always the case. Sometimes, we might double and take it out. It depends who he's playing with. But to me, I just think that particular player, his best attribute was his passing, not his scoring. And so we encouraged him to try to be a scorer instead of a passer. Other players, it'd be different. They don't have, their teammates aren't as good, or they don't have shooters on their team or whatever, or, they're a post player that can't pass the ball. Well, yeah, now we're going to double team him and not let him score and try to create the turnover because he's not a good passer. So it just depends on the player and the situation and stuff like that. But that's kind of, the basic idea is we want to force teams to try to score one-on-one and not use their whole team and get the ball going and moving and getting in rotations and having to fly out for closeouts and everything like that. We're set up and we know and we practice closeouts, constantly, but our goal is not to ever have to have a long closeout. That would be a perfect possession. But like I said, those rarely, if ever, happen.
I like the format of your books because you do what you just did. You describe the thought process of why we do things the way that we do and why maybe the old way of doing it, although it maybe has won your favorite high school coach or college coach championships in the past, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best way to do it. I know some coaches push back against that. If it was good enough for my coach, he won all these championships. You don't have that many championships, so we're going to keep doing it that way. Okay. But to be able to think through, this is why we're doing this. And I think bigger picture too is helping coaches build both their drills and then their overall system that will, maybe they've overlooked certain areas, like things that you just mentioned. That, do you want to give up an open drive to the basket? No. Okay. Well, then why do you do this that way? Well, I never thought about that before. When you put together the book, you've addressed these things, and then you have put together things for them to look at. When somebody purchases this book, what are they going to get in regards to the resources, so that it's more than just ideas and thoughts, but it's a resource that they can actually act upon?
I think most of the drills that I use still, are, in the book. I wouldn't say that I'm somebody who uses a lot of different drills. To me, I try not to overcomplicate things. So most of what we do is just going to be playing, and within the playing, then we might, add something or subtract something to focus on, a specific skill or a specific idea. We might play, we're playing 4-on-4, but we're going to start with the ball screen because we want to work on our ball screen defense. Or we're going to start with all the defensive players, starting the key because we want to start with the closeout and play off the closeout, whatever it is. So I'm not really a drill guy that much, although there are drills in the book, and most, if not all of them, now there's a video on YouTube for them, and there's a playlist on YouTube that for the book that you can access it even without buying the book, but it has the drills and it has examples from some of my teams doing most, if not all, of the things, some better than others, from games. So, and then, like the guy contacted me the other week, I'm pretty good about answering questions. If you email me or hit me on a DM on Twitter, somebody asked me a defensive question, my first, answer is usually going to be, well, have you read my book? Because that probably answers your question. But if you come with a specific question from the book or how to apply it or whatever, then, I usually will answer fairly quickly, like, hey, I read the book and it said to do this, but my team is this. What do you think? And then I'll, based on what the information you give me, I'll answer the question as to the extent that I can. Like I said, the book is a lot of general ideas that can be used, and then some drill ideas, to get you started in that direction. But then I frequently say drills are used to solve a problem. The problem that you have with your team, with your personnel, with how you're going to implement the things may not be the same problem that I have with my team. There are some standard drills that I use, and there are some things that I use on a daily basis or almost daily basis. But then there are a lot of things that I just do in the middle of a practice because we messed up this one thing. And so I want to focus on fixing this one thing. And it's not a drill that I've done before. It's probably, just adding something to 3-on-3 or 4-on-4 or maybe 1-on-1 or whatever the case may be. And so if it works really well, maybe I'll use it again, and then it becomes a drill, and then it's probably in the book already. But if it's something, let's say, somewhat esoteric, it might just be something that we use one time to fix this one problem, and then I never do it again. One of the drills, I use called my hard to guard drill now, basically, just to teach players to rip through, 1-on-1. It's not a drill that I had thought of. I was doing a clinic and none of the players were ripping through. I'm like, I got to figure out how to get them to rip through. So, okay, let's do this. And then now whenever I see that same problem, that's the drill that I use. And that's kind of how most of the drills have come from is, they're based on teams and situations. And I wanted to do something, or achieve something or fix something or practice something. And so, all right, well, let's do this, and if it works, we keep doing it. If it doesn't work, then we don't do it again. Like I said, the ones that I tend to use the most are probably in the book already. If there are new ones that I've started using more recently, then they're probably on the bottom of or like the newest videos on my YouTube page. But I don't know if I added any defensive ones so much this year, but like I said, most of what I do in practice is, I can say the one thing we did at every single practice this year was 1-on-1 full court. I just think if I could only do one thing at practice, that's probably what I would do, just because ball handling wise, finishing at the end, contested finishes, defense, I just don't think that there's a better single drill. But we play a lot of 1-on-1, 3-on-3, and 5-on-5. And then again, within those, we'll change up some of the rules or whatever to focus on something specific. But, and then I tend to, because I play a lot of games like that, I'm focused on the offense and the defense at the same time. Sometimes we'll do it where I'm focused only on one, or if I want to work on, something offensively, maybe I won't focus on the defensively because I want to give our offense a chance. But one of the reasons our offense sometimes doesn't work as well during games because we're not used to playing kind of standard defense. It has its good and its bad, over the long run, it ends up being good. Our offense, once we get playing against better teams, then we actually played better offense against the better teams than we did against the lesser teams, I guess, this year. Just kind of my approach is we play a lot, and then through the playing, we try to correct things that we see, because most of what I'm trying to do is to help players make better decisions in the game. To me, that doesn't happen just by, playing static drills or just trying to memorize movements, because every situation is going to be slightly different. It's not just a matter of one player making slightly better decisions, but it's also everybody else reading their teammates making those decisions. One of the things that I talk about a lot is it doesn't matter if I make the wrong decision, and I make the wrong play, as long as everybody else then adjusts to what I do, so if like, at the double team example, in the corner that I talked about, I make the wrong decision, you're closing out, you're going to get there first, and I'm closing out and I get there second. Okay, I made the wrong decision. Why am I closing out to somebody when there's already somebody closing out there? I should have seen you. I should have backed off, but I didn't. So now we're going to make the best of the situation. We're going to double team. Okay, but if the other three players aren't paying attention, they're probably going to get a layup off of that, because now we've probably left to go close out there. We've probably left the players who are closest to the ball at that point. So that player potentially has an easy pass to make, either for a wide open three or potentially for a layup. But if everybody else is paying attention and we can rotate quickly, now we've created that defensive advantage. Now we get a turnover. Even though I made a mistake and I made a bad play, we've turned that bad play into a good play. And that's kind of the idea of Antifragile again, is once we get in those chaotic situations, can we make it a positive instead of a negative? We don't replicate that through just static drills or whatever. We present the ideas. We say, okay, well, if we end up in this situation, this is what we want to do. But we've got to put them in those situations where it happens, so that they can start to read each other and say, oh, okay, he does this, so then I need to do this. Because like I said, there's even, like this season where almost every team we played ran almost the same offenses, the same versions of the same, kind of plays, countrywide. Every single possession is still a little bit different. The players that are using them are different. One team's a little bit more post oriented. One team's point guard can't shoot. One team's point guard, is big. One team's point guard, is quick and drives to the basket every time. Like, every single team is different, and how you're going to react to those different situations is going to be different. It's impossible to replicate every single possibility. So instead of me trying to prepare them exactly and tell them exactly what to do in every single situation, I want them to put them in as many situations as possible and have them read each other and make decisions on their own, so that they learn how to adjust and adapt once we get into games and face those kind of different opponents.
I love it. And the book again is Nada, the Antifragile Defense. The best place, I'm assuming, to get that is Amazon.
Yep.
Awesome. Coach, I appreciate it. We are going to do this again. I'm putting you on the spot and on record. We're going to do this for the offensive side as well. But great stuff as usual. Appreciate you taking time for this.
Thank you very much.